John chapter 11, begin reading in verse 1, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus. Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it's for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. Now the last time he was there, he had trouble, and that's what they're bringing up. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you. Are you going to go there again? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble because the light is not in them. After saying this, he told them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he'll be all right. Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. For your sake I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. Not a happy occasion. They figure they're going to kill him when he goes to Judea. Verse 17, when Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, already there's a stench because he's been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. If you have found yourself in seasons in your life in which you feel completely abandoned by God, in which you feel that the prayers you've asked for have gone unanswered, and you've sat commiserating in the wreckage left by the failure of God to do what you've asked, and you've asked the question, where is God? Why would he do this to me? I think we have a good word for you today. When we're looking for rescue, and the rescuer does not arrive before the thing we fear happens to us, the rescuer arrives too late. That's our experience. That's what happened to Mary and Martha. Jesus did not come, and Lazarus died. We're going to wrestle with that today. And if you don't hear anything else, this is the phrase I'd love for you to remember. When God's answer arrives too late to avoid the devastation we fear, we must remember that God raises the dead. When tragedy befalls us or those we love, and God seems to have abandoned us to our fears, it will help us to persevere if we can remember three things. The patience of Jesus, we're going to get into that. This is a patience that hurts us when he doesn't come when we ask, but it's the patience of Jesus we'll look at first. Secondly, the pathos of Jesus. Pathos is an old word for emotion. In rhetoric, it means manipulating a people through emotion, but that's not what I'm talking about. We get the word sympathy from it. We get the word empathy from it. Pathos means what you feel. We're going to talk about the emotions of Jesus, the pathos of Jesus, and then finally the promise of Jesus that he makes here in this passage to us when it appears to us that God has come too late for what we were asking for. Let's look first at the patience of Jesus. This comes from John chapter 11, verses 1 through 17, but I won't read the whole thing again. I'm going to read a selection. Look with me at verse 3. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus. Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it's for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, I love that that detail is added there by John and left in. After having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Now, we're not given any explicit indication in the text why it was that Jesus didn't come just when he was called. Perhaps Jesus' comment that the illness would not ultimately result in death took the pressure away from him. Maybe, as he indicates later, he wanted Lazarus good and dead, and for that reason he didn't come. Of course, Mary and Martha had none of that information when they simply did not receive word from Jesus. Perhaps Jesus' comment, though, it's weird to me when I think about Jesus and the way he responds. Could you imagine if somebody said, one of your best friends, a person that you love is dying, and you said, this one won't lead to death. It's for the glory of God, and then you didn't do anything for 2 days. People would be confused, right? And his disciples were somewhat confused. Lazarus was, in fact, going to die. So Jesus' language is somewhat cryptic, isn't it? Apparently what Jesus meant was that this illness would not result in ultimate death, right? He wouldn't remain dead. But that's confusing, because he was, in fact, going to die. And that's all over this passage, because the disciples are confused initially. Mary and Martha are confused. It's interesting to watch how Jesus navigates this road. Now, the end of chapter 10 tells us, and I know this was a long time ago, so I don't expect you to remember, that Jesus was staying around where John the Baptist had been baptizing during his ministry. And so that's on the Jordan River. Now, we don't know where exactly that was, but the distance as the crow flies from Bethany to the nearest part of the Jordan River is about 40 miles. And that's a long way to go. That's at least a 2-day journey for average walkers. So we're going to say that's a 2-day journey. Now, we don't know where he was on the Jordan River exactly, so it's a bit of guesswork. But if he's anywhere near Jericho, it would have taken Jesus about 2 days to get to Bethany. And when Jesus arrived, some of you are math students, how many days had Lazarus been dead? He had already been dead for 4. So Jesus delayed setting out for 2 days. What does that suggest to you? Suggests to me that when Lazarus was actually in the process of dying, that's when Jesus got the news. That Lazarus died upon Jesus receiving the news that he was sick. So the request to help did reach Jesus too late for him to physically get there in time. And yet, knowing that Lazarus was dying, Jesus did not immediately respond to the family. He delayed 2 days before setting out on a minimum 2-day journey. From Mary and Martha's perspective, they sent word to Jesus that their brother, who was a friend of Jesus, was in mortal danger, and Jesus did not come. That's their experience. I've sat with many a family in the church and in the world crying out to God for healing, crying out to God for intervention, crying out to God for more time with a loved one, for less pain in their bodies or the bodies of a loved one, all the while finding ourselves in the place of Mary and Martha. the thing we fear the most happens. God does not come in time. That's our experience. Now, it's possible God said no to the request. That's possible. But from our perspective, as my grandmother often said, the heavens were brass. She would say that when her prayers just seemed to not be getting through. It was like hitting metal. But somehow the miracle that God was intending to do required Lazarus not only to die, but he had to be irrefutably dead by all human reckoning. Now, Jesus knew that. God knew that. But Mary and Martha did not, and I want you to identify with them today. Mary and Martha, ignorant of this whole thing, had to suffer anguish and loss, grief, and the absence of Jesus himself in the midst of the worst of tragedies for them. For 4 days they mourned the loss of their brother, and who knows how long his sickness was before that, and Jesus was not there. In this case, Jesus' patience and his willingness to do the will of God in God's timing resulted in the suffering of people that the text describes as folks Jesus loved. Now, you and I, when we think of the word love, we often think of it as affection or preference, right? If I say to my wife, I love you, what I mean is I will treat you differently than I treat other people, right? I prefer you. And I've made covenants with you that are for you only, and I'll never treat anybody else in the same way. I love you. We say the same thing that we say to our children. I love you. That's really the only distinction between love and hate. Someone you love, you will be loyal to. Someone you hate, you don't much care for. They can do their own thing, right? So when we hear songs that tell us that God loves us, what most of us hear is he prefers me. But that's not the way God works. He loved Lazarus. The Bible doesn't say that about anyone other than John the Apostle. If John wrote the Gospel of John, we think he did, he calls himself the disciple Jesus loved. But other than that, we don't have any text anywhere that says Jesus had a special affection for anybody other than Lazarus. And Lazarus had to suffer and die. And not only once, twice. What I want you to know is that when your prayers have gone unheeded, when Jesus has not come when you asked him, when the miracle you were looking for was not given to you, it has nothing whatsoever to do with whether Jesus loves you more than somebody else or less than. There's no doubt in the Gospel of John that this was a family, for whatever reason Jesus in his flesh preferred, but it did not lead to preferential treatment. Now, you might think resurrection is preferential, but like I said, I don't want to die once. I definitely don't want to die twice. This was a sign for the people. It was not a gift to Lazarus. We have to remember in our own tragedies that what happens to us in our life does not indicate necessarily God's affection for us. Some of God's favorite people in the scriptures suffered terribly. And some people who were enemies of God throughout their lives seem to have blessing after blessing in the scriptures. Please don't determine God's love for you based on whether your experiences in life are positive or negative. Certainly, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus would warn you against that. The difficulty with the love of God is that he loves you, but he doesn't love you any more or less than anyone else. That's not the kind of love we're looking for. But the patience of Jesus sometimes will result in our suffering. Sometime, for whatever reason, God will not answer in the time frame we've given him, and the worst will occur. Sometimes miracles do not happen when we want them to, when we need them to, when we beg them to. And it does not mean God doesn't love you, nor does it mean that Jesus is not coming. And that's the mystery of this story. Let's look at the emotions of Jesus, the pathos of Jesus. I think this will help. This comes from John 11, 18 to 22 and 28 to 38. I won't read the whole thing. Look with me at verse 28. When she had said this, Martha, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, If you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. What I want to focus on is what Jesus is feeling here. It makes it sound right that Jesus was just emotionally upset, that he was grieved at what was happening. It's not, sadly, what the Greek says. The Greek, that phrase, "he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved," is better translated, "he became angry in spirit and very agitated." That's caused a problem for a great many people when they've tried to translate this verse. Why is he angry? And then 2 verses later, in the shortest English verse, he weeps. And then he's back to anger. What's going on here? So they've kind of come, a lot of translators over the history have come to believe that maybe by angry, the text just means to say he's disturbed or there's upheaval in his spirit. But I'm with more recent translators and with Martin Luther for that matter. I think the plain sense of the text should always be preserved. And this verb clearly says he was angry. Question for me is why? Who was he angry at? What was he angry at? Well, some theologians suspect that he was angry at Mary, the other mourners, that's why he was angry. One commentary said this, I just wanted you to see it. I actually don't agree with it, but I wanted you to see it. Despite the testimony of the Bible, despite the signs of Jesus wrought among them, which all bore witness to the life of the divine sovereignty that had come into the world through him, and despite the word that he proclaimed with its emphasis on the promise of life now and hereafter, they mourned like the rest of men. It was this unbelief of the people of God in the presence of him who is the resurrection and the life, arrived among them to call their friend and brother from the grave, that made Jesus angry. I don't think that's quite it. But I do think he was angry. But I don't think he was angry at the mourners. I think, and this is just my interpretation, I think Jesus was angry at sin. I think he was angry at the evil that precipitated in this moment for Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. I think that's where his anger was. In the midst of the grief, there is rage. Rage at why this has to happen, rage at the loss they're being forced to endure, rage at sometimes the illness that did this or the untimeliness of the death. There's rage. And it doesn't surprise me all that when Jesus watched all of his closest friends and the people of Jerusalem mourning the loss of one of their own, someone Jesus loved, it doesn't surprise me at all that he became angry. We were given opportunity to eat from the tree of life, and we were created to live forever in relationship with God. We abandoned that, and we were thrown into the cycle that all flesh now is thrown into, the cycle of living and dying and death. But I think Jesus rages against that. I think watching the pain causes great anger in him, and then that anger moves to mourning as he joins the mourners, and then back to anger. In fact, I think the scripture is telling us that part of what Jesus is doing when he comes to that tomb, and he looks at that tomb sealed up for 4 days, and he thinks about the corrupted body of Lazarus dying, I think what we have here is not sort of this soft Jesus coming to the tomb going, "Oh, Lazarus, come out, come out." I think what we have is an angry Lord going to battle against the powers of darkness. I think Jesus stands in front of that tomb and he confronts all the evil of all of history that has led every human who's ever lived to places of suffering and death and abandonment. And Jesus yells at that darkness with all the rage in his godly heart, and he says, "You're done. Lazarus, you're mine." And beneath it is the command of Jesus to death to let him go. I think an angry Jesus is exactly what we should see here, and it's what the gospel actually does say. You and I were not created to perish. Now, when Jesus is angry at darkness, and when we are angry at sin, of course, that's not like directed at some impersonal force. You and I are complicit in this thing. You and I, every time we deceive our brother, every time we refuse to forgive, every time we defend ourselves with violence rather than thinking about what the right course of action is, every time we treat another person as a means to our ends rather than ends in themselves, every time we think that the world is something for us to consume rather than care for, every time we do those things, we contribute to the darkness that leads to these moments. So it's not as though Jesus' anger is not at us, but it's not specifically with us because we suffer for these decisions. Jesus' war is against the power that we have made our God, the power of wickedness and selfishness. And this explains better for me why his anger is followed by tears. I don't know if you can be angry at the darkness without weeping with those who have been crushed by it, and Jesus evidences both. Jesus is angered by the sin and the suffering you have to endure. I believe that. In fact, I believe sincerely that's what this passage is saying. If you've ever felt abandoned by him and you feel like God looks at you with indifference and he doesn't really care of what you've had to suffer, if you sat in that moment where you asked for him to come and the miracle you were begging for did not happen and he came too late to save you from what you feared, do not think for a moment that you are more angry at that situation than he is. God was willing to give his life to turn back time so that you could have back what was taken. And he will do it. And he will not do it with a smile on his face. When the king of the earth comes at death and dying, when he comes at sin and wickedness, he will come in vengeance for what sin and darkness has done to you. You will be avenged. And vengeance belongs to God. Jesus is on your side, even though he didn't come and rescue you from the dark you begged him to save you from. He is still on your side, and that darkness is in his crosshairs, and it will be defeated. And this ties into the promise of Jesus. This comes from John chapter 11, verses 23 to 27 and 39 to 44. I'm just going to read some selections. Look with me at verse 25. Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" It's an interesting question to ask. Lazarus is dead. Yeah, we believed it until now. And I think that's something in her response. She says to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe you're the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." But that's a different, she doesn't answer his question. Verse 40. This is with Martha again. Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?" And Jesus, more or less, I'm paraphrasing, is looking at her saying, "So you think it's too late?" And she's saying to him, "Well, yeah, it's too late. I mean, I know he'll be raised at the end, but I wanted him now." And Jesus, "It's never too late." That's Jesus' answer. So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, and he prays, and it's the Father who raises Lazarus from the dead the way Jesus does it, not just Jesus. So that's cool. "Father, I thank you." And he gives Father the credit. Verse 43, when he had said this, he cried out with a loud voice. And because he had been angry, I think he screamed at that tomb, but you decide. I think Jesus screamed at the darkness. "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth and his face wrapped up in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Lazarus was dead. The worst had happened. Jesus had not responded. He didn't come. He came only in time to join in the weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's like the presence of God coming at the funeral, but not as a miracle in the hospital. That's what happened to them. If he was God, why didn't he come in time? In the other Gospels, Jesus didn't even have to be there to heal people. He could heal at a distance. We already found out that when Lazarus was dying, Jesus received the word. So why didn't he just give the word for him to be healed? Certainly healing would have come whether or not Jesus was physically able to be there. But no, Jesus refused to save Lazarus. That's the truth. Why? Well, we know why the gospel tells us, and that's what I'm focusing on. But let's be honest, when most of us are in this situation, otherwise come to mind. Maybe Jesus couldn't save him. Maybe Jesus is just a pretender. Maybe all the fanfare was nothing more than sound and fury. I mean, Jesus could heal diseases, sure. He could restore brokenness, sure. He's a pretty good preacher when it comes to the law, sure. But in the face of death and dying, he's just like all the rest of us. There's nothing you can do. This is the space in which Mary and Martha and the disciples sat in this moment. Why didn't he come? And what does it indicate about his power? But what happened next changed everything for them. And not only for them, for every one of us who lives ever afterward. Every one of us for whom God did not come in time and the worst happened. This is for you. Jesus ignored their call for help. He came too late to save his friend. Lazarus was dead. But it is never too late for Jesus. Jesus is still coming. Not even death can resist the word of God. After 4 days in the tomb, God raised Lazarus from the dead. Have you ever begged God to intervene before the worst happens, only to have your prayers float off into the nothingness? Some become agnostics in the wake of that. Some become atheists. Others become despondent. Others retreat into a kind of Christian fatalism that assumes that everything that happens just as it should happen and the only way it could happen, and they call everything that happens, no matter how monstrous, they just call it good. It's all God's will. But reality is more painful, and the scriptures are more honest than that. Those are both cheap answers. Sometimes the worst does happen. Sometimes God does come too late. From our perspective, we won't judge his time frame, but on ours. We feel his presence and his comfort only after the darkness has overwhelmed us. In these moments, Church of God, we must remember Jesus is still coming. He hasn't gotten here yet, but he is still coming. 4 days was too long for Mary and Martha. Some of you may wait 20 years, 40 years, 60 years to see the resurrection of the dead, but you will see it. Jesus is coming. There is no scar that God cannot heal. There is no suffering that he cannot erase. There is no evil that he cannot eradicate, even if the worst possible thing has happened to you in your life. Even if someone has done monstrous things to you that have left you scarred for all of your life, and you are living constantly with the baggage of the things you experienced, and you can never find health or wholeness, as long as you walk in this flesh, Jesus is coming. You will be free. When you are given your new body, when you are raised from the dead, all the evil done to you will be broken. It will not linger. It will not continue to exercise power. The person you really are is hidden with Christ in God, and he will reveal to you who you are in the last day. So do not give up. Do not turn from your faith. Persevere in living submitted to Jesus, no matter what, because Jesus is coming. And when he comes, restoration comes with him. And all that you've lost that was taken by wickedness and injustice and evil will be repaid. This is the promise of resurrection from Jesus. For those who believe, no matter the pain that goes from our loss to the time we finally receive back what was taken, the joy of that moment of reunion will wash away all the pain of the journey if we persevere in our faith, because that promise is only for those who persevere. Persevere in your faith. Jesus is coming. What evil has taken, he will restore. It is the year of Jubilee. But you may have to wait for his miracle, as Mary and Martha did. But your waiting will be rewarded. Do not give up. Verse 25, Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Do we? There's so much more bound up in that promise than we sometimes appreciate. The corruption of the world, in bondage to sin, the evil that others do to us with their free will, the corruption of our own bodies that we suffer under, especially as we get older, these things seem like tyrants from which we will never be free. All our lives in this flesh, these things exercise a type of influence and sometimes even control over us. And it's hard to imagine any other world. It's hard to imagine ever being free of it. It's hard to imagine a world in which we will be at peace with who we are, at peace with our bodies, at peace with the world, and in relationship with God. It's hard to imagine that world. Sometimes the condition we're in itself convinces us that there can be no God. God would not leave me for 4 days. God would not leave me for 4 years. God would not leave me for 40 years suffering this loss. How could he do this? And that's where Mary and Martha were, but Jesus came and raised Lazarus from the dead. Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in him, even though they die, will live. You will be remade in the image of Jesus. It is not an if, it is just a matter of when. No matter what anyone has done to you, their power will be broken. No matter what suffering you are enduring, you will be healed. No matter what stress is crushing you, liberation is coming. When Jesus comes, you will be free. Now, for most of us, many of those promises appear to be unfulfilled, and it looks like I'm just blowing smoke at you. And that's because all of us, every one of us sitting in this room, unless we're alive when Jesus returns, will enter a room we do not exit. Every one of us will die. One prayer at least will go unanswered. One time in our lives, Jesus will appear to come too late. Every single one of us, at least once. But for those who can say and believe and live that Jesus is Lord, even though that day is inevitable, we will live. And the shackles of evil and the ways in which it has ravaged us in our world will be broken. And the shout of Jesus to Lazarus, you will hear it too. There's a song that's sung sometimes at Easter, and I love it. It's the song, Arise, My Love. I always ask Jen to sing it if I'm in charge of things, because I love to hear it. Do you know the song, Arise, My Love? I imagine that's what it says the Father says to the Son when he rises from the dead in that song, and I imagine we'll hear it too. I imagine that no matter the circumstances of our deaths, if we died in faith in Jesus, that we will hear the word of God shattering the darkness, and we will hear the thunderous voice of Jesus saying, Arise, my love. And all that has broken you will be defeated. This is the cross. This is the gospel. And this is why we persevere. Who you really are is hidden with Christ in God. And you will meet who you really are when Jesus comes. You will be restored.